some time when we talk about what is government's economic growth vision. What would you say to that?
The government has to get out of the way for entrepreneurs and workers to grow the economy. We have a gatekeeper economy today, where we have the second slowest permits in the OECD. That means that capital has to sit on the sidelines for years while it waits to get a maybe out of the regulators. In many cases, this just means that capital doesn't sit on the sidelines, it leaves. We have 800 billion more Canadian dollars invested abroad than the world invests in Canada. So what's happening, there's this debate now about whether Canadian pension funds should be encouraged to invest more in Canada. Well, the question is, why aren't they doing it without government encouragement? The answer is because the governments have made this an uninvestable country where you can't get anything done. Whether it's like a small business that's trying to get a permit to expand by an extra 1,000 square feet, or a pipeline, or a mine, or a housing development, this is a nation in waiting. So we need to release those incredible productive energies. We should set a goal, and I'm going to be bringing together the provinces and the municipalities to set this goal. Let's make this the fastest place in the OECD to get a building permit at all three levels of government. That would unleash production right across this country. We have probably the biggest supply of natural resources per capita of any country on earth, and yet we can't produce those resources. So I will unleash that production, all forms of energy. The solution for our environment is abundant, affordable energy, not expensive and exclusive energy as our current government. You know this guy, this environment minister we have, he's incredible. He's against nuclear. He's obviously against oil and gas. He's against forestry. He wants to shut down Quebec's forestry sector because he says it's the only way to save 5,000 caribou. And he's against roads. We saw that as well. So I don't know what kind of mud huts he would have us living in, but this is the guy who is in charge of the environment for Justin Trudeau. We need to get rid of him and put in place a common sense minister who understands that our resources are a benefit to the world, not a hindrance to the environment. And then we need to cut taxes. The carbon tax is a massive disadvantage to our industrial sectors that drives production, ironically, to more polluting jurisdictions. By axing the tax, we will lower the cost of production and bring home more of that production to our Canadian economy. Thank you.
Vancouver is a port city, and we have a lot of folks in the room who work at waterfront businesses, who work at the port, who are from the labor community, and we also have a lot of folks in the room who are exporters. So can you talk a little bit about your view on expanding trade? It comes at a time where you were talking about investment, but expanding trade when we have really had some difficulties around our supply chains over the recent years, floods and fires, labor disruptions, disruption at the port. So maybe speak a little bit about expanding trade and how that could benefit some of the small and medium businesses in the room especially.
Well, we obviously have the great Ed Fast here. He was our former trade minister and concluded some of our best trade agreements. And he could answer this better than I could. But we need to make, I think at this point, our biggest challenge is no longer just adding new agreements. We have a lot of agreements. We have the CPTPP with most of the Pacific countries. We have Canada, EU. We have obviously a unfortunately diminished trade agreement with the States, which I will improve when I'm Prime Minister. But what we need is, one, to improve the agreements we have, and two, to make our country an enterprise zone. So let's focus on the first. My priorities in the U.S. is to get rid of the softwood lumber tariffs. It's insane that we're still paying these tariffs. Harper resolved the softwood lumber dispute in 100 days of becoming Prime Minister. He got $4 billion of U.S. collected tariffs reimbursed to Canada and all of the tariffs eliminated. He did that in 100 days. Trudeau's had 3 presidents in 8 years, and he hasn't solved the new softwood lumber tariffs. 2, we need an end to Buy America, which blocks Canadian businesses from doing subnational work in the U.S. In fact, it's even worse than that. Biden is trying to push a Buy America policy on federal procurement, something that was never in the original Buy America. Harper got us an exemption under Obama to Buy America. We need a full exemption to Buy America. We are an ally of the U.S. They should be, we should have reciprocal free trade on construction projects. And third, we need guarantees that our metals are not going to be subject to future tariffs by our biggest trading partner. And I will be focused on that. I will not be focused on woke virtue signaling and other grandstanding like the Trudeau government did, which is one of the reasons why we got such a terrible deal under USMCA. And finally, we need to make this into an enterprise zone. We need to make this the best place on earth in which to produce export products. Right now, it's too expensive, and therefore, even if you have a free trade agreement with other countries around the world, we can't beat their costs, because the biggest cost here is government. And by the way, it's not about reducing wages. We're not losing to low-wage countries anymore. We're losing to high-wage countries. Ireland, Switzerland, Australia, Singapore. They're eating our lunch. They have high wages. We need a high-wage economy with a low-cost government.
You were right that you were quite impassioned when you were speaking about judicial reform and public safety issues. We have long been talking about this is one of the greatest places in the world to live here in Vancouver, but you look around in our downtown core and many retailers are struggling around public safety issues. Theft and crime and vandalism is costing well over $1 billion to retailers in British Columbia alone per year. You did speak about judicial reform, but can you speak more about how you could help to address some of these issues that are being felt in Prince George and Nanaimo? And it's not just Vancouver. There's a coalition that has been built here called Save Our Streets, the SOS Coalition, and the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade is one of those members because there is so much concern. So can you speak a little bit about, aside from judicial reform, what else can be done to turn this around?
Well, first of all, the drug policy has to be completely reversed. I'm to the point where I don't even know what motivates the policy right now. You know, I thought it would, at first I thought it was just sort of a naive utopianism that was driving this idea of giving out free drugs and decriminalizing these poisons. But now that the evidence is so clear that it has been a nightmare, you have to ask yourself, what's motivating this policy? Because it is totally ravaging our communities. And my common sense plan is to stop funding the distribution of drugs, stop funding these consumption sites, which are not safe, and instead invest in treatment and recovery services. We know this works. You know, Winnipeg visited an incredible facility where they bring in the addict, they give them detox, counseling, group therapy, sweat lodges for First Nations, exercise and yoga programs. They're building attached housing so that the graduates of the program can live in transition nearby, come back for a therapy session, for some exercise, or maybe even to mentor an incoming addict. And the success rates are incredible. That's how we're going to bring our loved ones home drug-free and break the cycle of addiction that is raging out of control in our country.
And that will address some of the issues that we're feeling.
I think if you look at some of the, like whether it's Timmins or the downtown east side of Vancouver, the inner city chaos is partly driven by drug addiction. There's no question about it, and that's what drives the theft. They're stealing so they can buy drugs. And so the petty theft is largely the result of addiction, then it graduates into more violent acts by more desperate people. So we have to defeat the drug addiction crisis if we're going to stop the crime crisis.
You spoke in great detail about housing, and we know in Vancouver it is a long, long challenge for us that really hampers our ability to attract and retain talent. And you spoke about cutting costs and government getting out of the way and speeding up permitting and linking federal dollars to municipalities to targets. Are there other considerations that would be on the table, whether it would be interest-free mortgages like the US does, or cutting taxes elsewhere within the system, to really start to unlock some of the value and to change the crisis that we're in?
What do you mean? What kind of tax policies?
Looking at any kind of the taxes that are built into the housing system right now, like what else could be on the table to really see some meaningful change quickly?
I'm open to the idea of cutting more taxes on home building, and we're looking at different options on that. We supported taking the GST, HST off of rental construction. We obviously are going to get rid of the carbon tax, which raises the cost of transporting materials, but also, for example, drywall has natural gas ingredients in it. It becomes more expensive with the carbon tax. By axing the tax, we'll bring homes that people can afford. But the biggest tax of all is the massive delays in getting permits for construction. And this is where I put the challenge over to the business community. You know, the home builders tell us, what I just said, the home builders have been saying for years. My question to the home builders is, what have you done to defeat gatekeeping local politicians in elections? Where is your coalition to defeat these politicians, these mayors and councillors who stand in the way of home building? Because if you don't do that, it's not going to change. You can write another essay or commission another paper by the C.D. Howe Institute, but if these politicians keep getting elected to block home building, then they'll keep blocking home building. So that's what I mean when I say the business community actually has to step up, because the only way we're going to make homes affordable for people is to get the gatekeeping out of the way at all three levels of government. And it's time that the home building companies actually play a leadership role in the politics of driving that change.
I could keep you on the stage for a very long time with lots more questions, but I do know you have other places to be. So if I could ask one last question to wrap up our conversation. We recently lost Canada's 18th Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. Friends and foe alike gave quite the tributes to him. I really reflected a lot about what Jean Chrétien said and talked about how they took themselves seriously, their work not so much. And it really was a different time in politics. He was a consequential leader, Mr. Mulroney, and many would say quite an incredible statesman. When you reflect on his legacy, what comes to mind? And then when you think about what you're going into now in maybe October of 2025, what kind of leadership do we need today, and how could you bring the country together?
Well, first of all, I reiterate my love and support for the Mulroney family. Mark Mulroney, his son, is one of my best friends, and I was very saddened when he called me with the news that his father had passed. And I'm also very grateful for the mentorship Brian and Mila have provided Anna and I on his political legacy. A couple of things. One, though his agenda was very controversial at the time, very controversial. You mentioned that everyone praises him now. Well, at the time, he would tell you that that wasn't the case. He had to take on a lot of entrenched interest in order to achieve frankly, the revolution that he brought at the time. Privatizing Air Canada and numerous other crown corporations that had been very entrenched. Reducing the cost of government. He brought in among the slowest spending growth of any government in history. He balanced the operational budget. We had an ongoing deficit because of the interest on the preceding Trudeau government's debt. He obviously opened up Canada to free trade with the United States. He brought in the inflation target. Up until then, the Bank of Canada had no mandate of any clear purpose, so they just kept printing money and leading to double-digit inflation. He brought in a 2% inflation target. And he, internationally, he was firmly on the side of freedom against Soviet communism, which was a change from the previous government. And he was on the side of freedom in South Africa against apartheid, which was a lonely position for him to take in the Western world at the time, but obviously he has been proven right. So the lesson I take from that is that he was prepared to stand alone in order to stand for what was right. And that it wasn't easy in the short run, but in the long run, he has been vindicated. And finally, the fact that everyone has heaped so much praise on him in the last days since his passing is proof of the common sense consensus that he helped forge. The aforementioned policies that I just listed, though they were controversial in 1984, they became almost a unanimous consensus thereafter. Balanced budgets, free enterprise, privatization, fast support for our resource sector, all of those things were widely supported by all three of the major political parties up until 2015. And what I'm hoping to do is bring back the common sense consensus that we had among Liberals, NDP, and Conservatives for those values that made our country so prosperous, so safe, and such a wonderful place to be up until 2015. That is what we're going to restore, and that is what we're going to bring home. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.